Good evening. I'd like to call the February 25th, 2020 work study session to order. Deputy City Clerk, may I have a roll call, please?
Mayor Brown?
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Krupa?
Here.
Councilmember Meyer?
Here.
Councilmember Percival?
Here.
Councilmember Wright?
Here.
Thank you.
And public comment period. At this time, members of the public may only comment on an item appearing on the agenda. Please adhere to the following when addressing the council. Comments will be limited to 3 minutes or less and should be directed to the council as whole and not directed to individual council members. Do we have any speaker slips from the public?
No, Mayor, none have been turned in.
Okay, then we'll go on to item 3A. And City Attorney Vail is poised for the staff report.
I'd be happy to talk with you a little bit about new city protocols. This has been, I think, on various future agenda items for various councils over the years. Better? Pick up now?
Yeah.
Okay. Real easy tonight. You don't need to give me input on what you want the protocols to be. That's a little more elaborate process, and it should take the council some time. What I've provided to you is a draft amalgam, if you will, of some of the basic provisions that many other cities include, and Hemet included in its previous protocols, that you can use or change. Main thing I want to impress upon you tonight is that this document is the City Council's document. It needs to reflect your tone, your tenor, what's important to the council. We've suggested a number of basic provisions and some alternative phrasing that you can use. You're by no means locked into it. So tonight I just kind of want to discuss the draft, what protocols are. The only feedback I'm really hoping to get out of you tonight is, what process do you want to go through going forward? I'm going to highlight some of the key sections, really not to read through them for you and have you select an alternative or one way or the other. I just want to get you thinking about things that might be important to you as a council member, both individually and working as a group. It says I'm going to collect comments. That's not really my intent. My intent is to get you thinking about what your comments are, and then most importantly, have you talk about what process that you want to use. I've used several different processes with councils over the years in different cities, and really what works is what works for the council. Two basic ways to do it, number of different permutations. I think that creating an ad hoc that can consist of city manager, city attorney, city clerk, a consultant that you might want to use, and two council members works well to work through this. The ad hoc would come back and then provide recommendations to the city council. The benefit of an ad hoc is that you can take this over a series of meetings. You can talk about it. You can talk with people in the community if you would like, and then you can come back and have one or more study sessions with the full council. The alternative way to do it is to each of you review individually and then come back and have study sessions like this where the council talks about it. You probably wouldn't do the whole thing. You'd probably break it into sections, and then you would all talk about it together at the same time. Either process works well. It depends on what you think is going to be most effective for you and what's going to elicit the best collaborative document. Protocols are basically another way of phrasing self-imposed standards. You're all subject to the Brown Act, Conflict of Interest, Public Records Act. There's no need in my mind to restate all of that in your protocols. It's already in the law. But what you might want to do is set a higher standard, set ethical decision-making processes for yourselves and I think most importantly, kind of lay out the ground rules on how you're going to make decisions and how you're going to get along. So some things to think about as you go back and read or reread the draft protocols over the next couple weeks are: what do you want to include in here that will really assist you as the city council and as a council member to improve the effectiveness of the council, or to include improve the collaboration of the council, or the transparency of business and decisions, or whatever is important to the council? What clarifies your roles or activities? What provides transparency? What strengthens ethical conduct? What codifies things that you did well in the past? What codifies things that you're doing well now that might not be reflected in your existing protocols? This is the opportunity to really come up with a governing document for the council that works the way you want it to work. And you might also address perceived problems or weaknesses and how to correct those within the protocols. Very common elements in the protocols are provisions that address openness, sometimes called transparency, fairness of process. That's really a short way of saying how do you act without bias, and how do you make sure that people that come before the council have a fair hearing of their idea. Agenda preparation and placing items on the agenda, always an issue for every council. How are we going to do that? We'll talk about some provisions in there. Council committees, how are those formed? How do they operate? How should appointment to commissions, committees, boards of the council, like for example the infrastructure committee that we just talked about, this would be a place where you could encapsulate whatever rule or process you want to follow on filling planning commission or ad hoc committees or task force or whatever you come up with. Also, how are you going to use city personnel, equipment, and resources? This is a good place to state the council's understanding with the city manager on how you're going to access city staff, how the city manager is going to staff task forces and committees and so forth. It's a good place to talk about the city's relationship with the community. And on the other side, I'll just go ahead and mention I have two interaction of members. That's twofold. One, interaction of members with the community individually, and interaction of council members amongst yourselves. Ethical decision making, I've included an attachment that I developed a long time ago with a professor at the Markula Institute of University of Santa Clarita. She was a former judge. That I had her work on a set of protocols with me a long time ago on how councils can go through ethical decision-making processes individually when they approach some of the items. You do not have to include that. It's just there for your resources and review. You might want provisions in your protocols that help ensure efficiency, accountability of action, things like that. Sometimes communities use protocols to help reestablish some trust with the community or to strengthen already existing trust or relationships. Depends on the situation that the council thinks that the city is in. And lastly, enforcement. Protocols are usually adopted by a resolution, and then they're self-policing. They are really a commitment that the council has made individually and collectively to say we're going to abide by this. There are usually always enforcement provisions that are difficult to implement. You're all elected officials, so nobody can strip you of your office just for violation of the protocols, which usually means we end up with something like an investigatory procedure for alleged claims of violating the protocols with some type of censure. Censure is the local government's way of elected officials slapping each other's hands. Hey, you shouldn't have done this, violated the protocols. Doesn't result in you losing any of your council privileges because you can't, you're elected officials. But we'll talk about that more in depth as you go through the process. One of the first steps in protocols is sort of setting the tone, and that can be done by a preamble. I've given you some ways that cities have made pledges or commitments at the very beginning. The alternative way is you list the city's mission statement and your relevant goals. I don't recommend that you do that. You're going to have a goal-setting session, a strategic planning session. You'll probably come out of that with a document that will state your goals, and those should change more often and frequently than your protocols do. But it's an option. You might choose some of them that are important, or maybe a relevant part of your mission statements informs how you're going to interact with the community and with yourselves. Fairness of process. One of the ways that fairness of process manifests itself has to do with how council members are going to interact with development projects or people filing an application. Some cities want to impose upon themselves some limits or disclosure requirements for council members, and this is council members imposing it on themselves, on how you're going to interact with a developer or with an applicant. Are you going to sit down and talk to them by yourselves? At what point is it okay to do that, and at what point should you not do that? Or if there's no limitation, should you disclose that at a public hearing? Under California law, the minimum requirement is that you've had some kind of discussion about the project, toured the project, sat down with the developer or the applicant. If it's a public hearing item, you're supposed to disclose that in advance. So that's kind of the baseline of the law. Some cities go farther. You need not do that, but it's something you should give some thought to. Decorum and debate. A lot of different ways this is handled in protocols. Both of them are typical. So I know they say proposed and alternative, but you'll find both of these intermixed together. Usually there's some statement that requires or encourages. Protocols are usually aspirational as opposed to mandatory or prohibitive, that encourage council to engage in debate, ask probing questions, be civil and polite, exhibit courtesy, avoid interrupting people on the dais as you're giving your speech. And also typically they're going to give to the mayor as the presiding council member the chair of parliamentary procedure. Mayor calls someone out of line, so on and so forth. Sometimes mayors have the unfettered discretion to do that. Sometimes their calls are subject to appeal by the council themselves. And I haven't seen many times that has happened in the city of Hemet. So sometimes you might just not need that level of detail. Which is another thing I'd like for you to think about as we go through this. Some of these provisions are very detailed and fairly narrow. Some of them are broader. Depends on how the council and the city want to operate. This is why you need to make the document yourself. You can have a document that's very flexible, easier to understand, or for different reasons, sometimes you need to have a lot of very formal procedures, very detailed for people to follow. Really depends on which way you want to go. I mentioned parliamentary procedure. This is a good document to describe what set of parliamentary rules of procedure you're going to follow. I have a personal preference for Rosenberg's Rules of Order. They're a much more simplified version than Robert's Rules of Order. Both of them are fine. If you choose one, then we should try to adhere to it. And really, there's a document put out by the League that is real basic parliamentary procedure. It's about 3 pages long. That's about all that you need. We don't do a lot of parliamentary motions back and forth, or reconsideration, or an amendment of that. You don't have to keep track of what's on the floor and what's the main motion, and if you are, we're all in trouble, because that's way too complex parliamentary for 5 people on the council. But I would suggest that you review either one of these. They're online. If you'd like a copy, I can get you copies of both of these, and you can talk about what the differences are. At the very end of this, when you decide which one you want to have in as parliamentary procedure, right now it's Robert's Rules of Order per your municipal code. We can come in and do a training for you as part of your council meeting as a work study on little bits of it on how motion practice should work, how what standards you have to follow. Nice thing to keep in mind, though, is that failure to follow parliamentary procedure under California law doesn't invalidate a motion or an action. So it really, that's why I say it's a great place to have it in your protocols, because it's part of the system of how the council should operate and wants to conduct its own business together. Attentiveness at meetings was never anything we saw in protocols until cell phones were invented. And when cell phones were invented and then email became a big thing, provisions like this became popular. Excuse me. You can see some easier, shorter provisions on the proposed side, some lengthy, more formal provisions on the alternative side. They both basically say the same thing, which is, hey, you shouldn't be taking phone calls or texts or shooting emails in between, and you should avoid sidebars. You should give your full attention to the business at hand. I would ask you to think through this, because you all have iPads, tablets, phones. You get a lot of information. Sometimes you have the agenda on there. So it's not as easy as it used to be when we just had cell phones. So I think even the provisions that are up there now are a bit outdated in terms of what you'll need to have on the council. You're going to want people to use their laptops and your tablets and your iPads, but do you want them to be taking phone calls, or do you want to be able to share emails back and forth? It really depends on what you want the audience, either here or on webcast, to perceive you doing. And it's I think more of a presentation, and that's why we call it attentiveness at order. And I don't suggest by anything that I've put up here that the council has a problem with any of these. These are just things that typically appear in protocol. All right. How do we place an item on the agenda? Something every council goes back and forth about. You have a process right now where the city manager creates the agenda, the mayor can place an item on the agenda, council members with the concurring vote of a majority of their council can, in a council meeting, put things on the agenda. This runs the whole spectrum from only the city manager to any council can put anything on the agenda they want to at any time. It really depends on what kind of culture you guys want to have and what you find, again, facilitates your best effectiveness. So that's an issue I would encourage you all to think about. We can put in there any process that works the best for the council. Appointment. How do you want appointments to not only your ad hocs and standing committees to work, but also the rest of your committees? Right now, unless you took additional action, we would take the direction that you gave, I think in reference to the infrastructure committee, and just incorporate that in. But if you want to change it, or if you want to make it different for different committees, you can do that. Sometimes you might feel that, for example, the planning commission needs to have one appointment process, and the infrastructure committee or some other committee needs something different. Right now, in terms of council committees, the mayor makes those appointments. As long as everybody agrees, you could keep it informal like that, or you could go more formal and say that it requires the whole council to agree and vote on each appointment to an ad hoc committee or standing committee. You also have an informal process for how your committees report back to the full council right now. It's really under the alternative. It's a verbal report. More technically, it's an oral report that you do during your committee appointments. Some cities use written findings and recommendations. There's benefits of both. Written findings and recommendations are wonderful, except that they do take more time and they require a written document that either requires both of the ad hoc or standing committee members to agree to, or they have to do their separate ones because they have different recommendations and they disagree, and that does take a little bit more staff time. The alternative is you don't have anything written, but you're able to freely share that during your council reports or the city manager's report or an ad hoc committee report on there. That has worked very well for the city over the years, so keep in mind, again, the balance of how you want to be able to conduct your business. Staffing. Generally, task forces, ad hoc committees, standing committees need staff support. And you should have a rule in your protocols that you and your city manager have come to agreement on as to what level of support and staffing committees, task forces are going to have. Some say may, leave it up to city manager. Some say shall, will provide the support, and it might depend on committee, might be at full council's discretion, a number of different ways to go there, but it is something we should clarify in the protocols. Council correspondence. The next two slides really have to do with a number of different ways the council communicates with and interacts with the community and other entities in the community. A very common provision is to require that every letter or correspondence that a council member goes out has to be CC'd on all of the rest of the council members. That might be too much. It's certainly a good way to be transparent, but you might decide that you don't need every single letter that goes out. We have now a policy and an ordinance on use of seal, logo, and letterhead. You'll remember that the administrative policy that was adopted by resolution that's applicable to the staff right now applies to council. If you want to change that and make it more specific for how the council can use seal, logo, and letterhead, protocols is a great place to do it because it's going to be adopted by resolution. And so that's an issue you should work through. Sometimes sorry, I flipped over the wrong thing. I think we've already covered that. Let me go to this. How does a council member engage with the community? Some cities will specify in their protocols that council members are not acting in an official capacity unless they're designated by the city council to act in that capacity. Which means if you're out at a meeting or you've gone someplace, unless you've been designated to do that by the city council, you're not representing the city. You're there by yourself. Other cities leave it open. Right now, your protocols don't really address this, and you have to assume then, without a provision, that anytime you're out with a community group, you're going to be seen as a council member acting in your council capacity. There are some benefits both ways. It depends on how active you want to be without wearing your council hats out in the community. I don't know that it's been a tremendous issue, but in some cities it really has been, and they've needed to clarify that. Something to give a little more thought to. Ethical decision making. This can take a lot of different forms. I've included, as I said, an ethical decision making guide on how to make, gut check your ethical decisions. One of the ways this shows up in many protocols is a voluntary gift limit. Now, you're already subject to the Political Reform Act's rule on gifts, which is implemented by the Fair Political Practices Commission, and right now your gift limit is $500 per 12 months per single source. Some cities restrict that even further. Some put an additional, I think, sounds good but difficult to apply, avoid an appearance of impropriety rule on that. This is one of the instances where you can say, we're good with state law, or you can set a more stringent standard upon yourself. You can do that for a number of different things, public records, Brown Act, but when you do, be careful because we're going to have to adhere to those more difficult standards. This also manifests itself in voluntary campaign contributions. Some cities impose, some councils choose to impose voluntary campaign contribution limits. They don't necessarily recommend them because they do not apply to people who aren't council members. So when you're a council member and you put this in the protocol and now you're running for re-election, you're saying that you're going to voluntarily comply with the campaign contribution limit, but other people that are running against you or for your seat aren't subject to the protocols. If the city council's interested in this, we can look into an ordinance or a ballot measure that would create some campaign contribution limits. Typically, we'd only see these in cities where campaign contributions are getting exorbitantly high. I don't track where they are in the city, so I don't know whether they're considered to be exorbitantly high here. And you've really just moved to districts at this point, and you haven't really gone through a full cycle of that. So I put it up there to say this is one of the ideas of things. I don't necessarily recommend this. We can define better the position of mayor and the powers, honorary or otherwise, that the mayor can have in your protocols. We've added some things about conduct at public meetings, relations with your fellow council members, communication and appearance at meetings. These are just things to get you thinking about. You should have provisions that address these, but they can be phrased in any way you want to. So don't feel that you're locked into any of this. There's no, other than the Brown Act and Public Records Act and conflict of interest rules, we're pretty free and open on how you want to phrase things here. And if we come up against the state law, we'll be able to tell you that in the process of you crafting these. Almost done. I did mention enforcement. Typically, enforcement is based on yourselves, just self-policing. Some protocols have a provision that allow either the city manager or the city attorney to do an investigation of allegations or complaints that a council member has violated the protocols. Often there will be a provision on enforcement of the protocols that has some kind of decision-making process and some type of censure. Anything from, we think you've done something wrong, to we're removing you from all of your appointed committees that you're on. Can't remove you from your seat. All right, that was a quick overview of protocols, some of the things you should give thought to. The things that I have listed are not an exclusive list. There could be a lot of other things you want to come up with. I would encourage you to have some discussion at this time on how you would like to move forward with these, whether you'd rather do it as a committee as a whole at a number of study sessions, or whether you like the ad hoc model. It is completely up to you, and if there's some other idea, you can be open to that too.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate the walkthrough with that. Deputy City Clerk, do we have any requests to speak on this agenda item?
No, Mayor, there are no requests.
Council, questions, comments of City Attorney?
I just have one from the standpoint of how being in districts now affects some of these protocols that we currently have in place. through it, and I thought immediately about how the being districts affects that. Now I can't remember which one it was, because I forgot to mark it, but.
It does in one sense. Your existing protocols don't contemplate you having meetings within your district. And in fact, they're silent on council members themselves having essentially many city council meetings or city hall meetings or town meetings or something like that that aren't actually council meetings, but give you an opportunity to meet with your constituents out of city council in a more formal format. That's a very good, I think, example of what should be in your protocols to address how you're going to deal with districts.
Right.
Each council member probably does need to be out in their district holding some kind of meeting throughout the year.
Well, I'll have to go through.
Michael? Linda?
Well, I had gone through the original one, and I see I have a lot of highlighted things, so now I'll go back and compare to this and take into consideration what you've given us in this presentation, and then see if I still have questions, or if they're now answered. But I don't have any preference to how we go forward, so I'll leave that to the rest of you. How's that? Did you like that?
Yeah.
All right. Does anyone have a preference of the process that we proceed with? I do, but and the rest of you?
I think for me, I'd like to see portions at a time. Just, go through a section and I don't have a problem with an ad hoc committee either, bringing in recommendations. Stuff, so. What's your recommendation?
Actually, my recommendation or my preference, I think, is I would call it a hybrid of the two. I believe in the value of ad hoc committees, especially if you have a meaty project to undertake. We're all busy in our own lives and different things, and I think to take for example, we've got a good start with the draft that was presented, but for each of us to go through that and mark it up and then bring it back, I think it just gets unwieldy. I like your idea of maybe breaking it into sections, so it's smaller bites. But I value the benefit of an ad hoc committee, particularly if you have the city manager and city attorney, because you've got staff interest represented there, you've got legal interest represented, and you've got council members. Consultant could be valuable, but consultants are expensive, and I don't know that we would necessarily need a consultant when it comes to a topic like this. So I think what I would propose is an ad hoc committee pretty much as recommended or proposed, and then identify sections that we would start with, and then those, once the ad hoc committee has done their work, then they bring it to the full council, either through an email, and we have a chance to review it, mark it up, highlight it, and then we have a discussion, and once we reach consensus, then we go on to the next section. So it would be more time consuming to do that, but I think the end product would probably be better.
I think that too, that I'm glad you said send it out in an email, because you give us time to review it before we come to discuss it.
Yeah.
We don't do that often enough, and we're hit with something to go over, and we don't really have the time to delve into it like we should. So I would really encourage that we take that. or sent out an email ahead of time for us to review.
That could potentially even be a component of the protocols.
Yep.
Okay, you're leaning forward now, you have a comment.
I have some thoughts now. So
Okay.
I don't necessarily disagree with an ad hoc, but I kind of do a little bit, and especially when it comes to the protocols. I think this is something that should be done in the work study session, because if you've got two council members bringing a recommendation for different sections that could be contrary to the other three, I think that this is something, since it affects all the council members, I think this is something that should be discussed with all the council members to provide input to come to a consensus on the entire thing. But I think that doing it in bite-sized pieces is probably going to be much easier to get done and do it in sections and over several meetings at a work study session.
I get what you're saying, and I certainly agree with that in some respects, but when you have the ad hoc committee, and especially since it's going to have the city manager, attorney, couple council members, it's not really like two council members just hacking this out and trying to decide what we should do and what we shouldn't do. I think that as far as the protocol goes, and in that discussion as a group of the ad hoc committee which has expertise in the group, I think it's not so likely that they'll come to us and, it's still open for discussion, whether there's two or whatever, and we can still decide as a council whether or not we agree with that or we don't, and then go into greater discussion.
And I don't disagree with that. I think that I think my point is that if you do the ad hoc and you got two council members and the city attorney and the city manager going in one direction, and then it comes to council and it goes a completely different direction, that ad hoc committee time was just completely wasted. And I would hate to see that happen.
Well, but you can say the same thing about council discussion after things have already been, or haven't been vetted out. So that takes a much longer process, per se. And, I'm good with either way. Yeah, I can see the benefit of one, having city attorney, city manager, and as was mentioned in the presentation, I can see the benefit of that, and then come and further that discussion. But,
We can put you on the ad hoc committee if that'll make you feel better.
That's not where I'm going with
Oh.
I think my overarching objective was efficiency of time and energy. And I could just see a work study just really dragging. Because if we all took this document and we mark it up like Linda has already started, and then we go basically line by line or section by section, we'll all have the opportunity for input, but I think you're looking at an awful lot of time to do that in a public study session form, and I think that scut work, if you will, could be done more efficiently through an ad hoc, and as Bonnie mentioned, we all have the opportunity, because my vision is that you say we take this section and the ad hoc committee works through it, and then they present their recommendations to the full council through an email, and we set a time for that to be agendized, and we discuss the recommendations from the ad hoc, and we all have a chance to chime in at that point. And if it goes a different direction, so be it, because that's how it has to work. But I think, by and large, we've got a really good start here already with the draft, and I just think that could be an efficient way to approach it, and rather than having to do it over, I think, a number of study sessions, because it wouldn't get it all done in one study session.
And another thing too is if there's certain things that one of us are, in favor of or not when we're reading through it. Like when we know that the ad hoc is on this section, we can send them to the city manager or the city attorney so that you're represented or
Brings
you
in.
know, and then the
Good
ad hoc
point.
committee can still do.
That's a good point.
And in fact, I would encourage that as the committee decides, if you do an ad hoc, decide what sections you're going to do, that the city manager and I will send out an email to the whole council saying, we're going to be reviewing these sections. If you have comments, suggestions, questions, real issue, provide them to the city manager, and then we'll provide a blank tabulation back so that, we disconnect it from the names. But that way you have the information, so you're not operating in a vacuum, because I think Councilmember Percival makes a good question, or makes a good statement. Sometimes you go way off in this direction. It's helpful to know where, what other input is out there. And you can even do that with members of the community, too.
Sometimes with that method, you come up with a compromise between the interests, so it's just a better process.
Yeah, well, I think Carly's suggestion of funneling input from the non-ad hoc committee members through the city manager and city attorney, it guards against Brown Act violations, but it still provides a pathway for those thoughts to be conveyed. And I think that's important, and I think it'll streamline the review later on. Am I sensing a consensus that we go for an ad hoc approach with those provisions built into it?
I'd like to see that.
I'm okay with that.
Just as long as we're moving forward.
Okay. Does anybody have an interest in participating in such an ad hoc?
Mayor, you need to be on.
I'll do it.
So there's two.
Who's the second one?
You.
I already said you.
Well, you're there for time. And
You already have your document type.
yeah, I do. Well,
I sense you're being voluntold.
Because my time is too limited. I mean, if I had to say, I couldn't get involved on a step 4:30. I'm not gonna, it's bad enough that I have to do that, so.
Okay?
Thank you, Council.
Thank you. And thank you, council. Sufficient direction? Okay. Moving on to item 3B, we have a work study, consideration of a revised records retention schedule. And Deputy City Clerk James is going to give us a staff report.
So as Clay is getting his presentation ready, this has been on our radar for a number of months now, and I know that the staff has been talking about this. Clay has done an outstanding job in reaching out to departments, working with legal, and working really collaboratively with everyone involved to make sure that everybody's input, the correct documents that each department has, each division has, are incorporated here. And so our approach today is largely our desire is to make sure that the council isn't seeing this for the first time and asking the council to vote or take action on it. So tonight we wanted to go over the item before you, provide the opportunity for you to ask questions, dive deep into this item, and then subsequent to that, we do want to come back at a future council meeting and do request council action at a future date. So with that being said, we'll go ahead and hand it over to Clay to go through this presentation.
Thank you, City Manager. The item is actually in the packet. It's page 198. It's attachment 4 of item 3B. So this, like City Manager said, we've been working on it for about 5 months, and most recently for the retention schedule with the executive team, and they've done an outstanding job in providing feedback and how we're going to maintain our records. I just want to provide a brief history on records. The federal government established the General Service Administration in 1947 to establish regulations on and guidelines for records for the federal government, which established the Freedom of Information Act, which California in 1968 enacted the California Public Records Act. There's been quite a few acts that have passed One that I'd like to note is the Secretary of State's guideline in 1999. Those are the same guidelines that the city has right now to manage their records and the retention schedule. So it is a little bit older. So the need for an updated records management program, to put some emphasis on the importance of records management. In the past 3 years, the amount of new information in the world has almost doubled. The city is no exception, and to illustrate this, on average, the city's email system receives 610 inbound emails and 62 outbound emails an hour. So there's a lot of information coming into the city and going out, and we really need to have a retention schedule that captures that information. So the current records management is more than 21 years old, which was in 1989, and at that time I was only 5 years old, so a lot has definitely changed.
You don't have to ad lib.
I'm gonna believe it. A good records management program will also provide accessibility to information. We'll establish how we're going to store, provide retrieval methods, and lastly, liability. By having a good records management system, we'll reduce our risks and help ensure that we're following a risk management program. So the existing records management program places emphasis on paper-based records. It relies on antiquated workflows and relies heavily on physical storage. And we have archive centers and areas that are being used by records, which could be used for office space. And apart from that, it's also difficult to manage, figuring out where records are stored. The existing retention schedule, properly prepared and approved records retention schedule is an agency's legal authority to do whatever needs to be done with records and documents entrusted to the agency's care. It certifies the life, care, and disposition of all agency records. Similar to adopted records management program, the current retention schedule is outdated. Schedule should be considered current for 5 years unless amended sooner due to a significant change in the city's record-keeping practices. A change in mission, added functions, new programs would all trigger an amendment to the retention schedule. Regardless of any amendments, a new schedule should be prepared and approved regularly and within 5 years. And you can see on the image on the right, the current schedule only lists the type of record and its retention period. It doesn't specify where the records are kept, what statute it follows, and the terminology is outdated and it follows state records. So proposed resolution would allow destruction of non-historical records after imaging in a ECMS, which is an enterprise content management system. Currently the city has Laserfish, which is a certified program, and it provides security features that allow for this practice to occur. Another option in the resolution would be to allow destruction, also delegate the attorney authorization to destroy records without council approval. This would allow city staff to regularly perform records management tasks and maintain operational functions. The resolution also authorizes the city manager to make administrative policies regarding records management until formally brought to council. This would apply if the city created a new body or a program or function. And lastly, the resolution would implement a revised records management program manual and records retention schedule, which those are included in the packet as drafts. If adopted, the records management program would provide instruction for records management at all levels of the city's organization, promote electronic storage instead of physical storage by allowing the destruction of eligible image records, establish audits to ensure compliance, establish naming conventions and uniform filing practices to to help enable retrieval procedures, establish a records coordinator for each department, and if the records retention schedule is adopted, it would add more description for each record, allowing staff more ease to follow established retentions. It would also follow the city's organizational structure instead of the state's 1999 guidelines. And lastly, would be more robust and comprehensive due to the extensive involvement of department members in its creation. So the recommendation tonight is to direct staff to bring a resolution for council consideration at the March 10, 2020 City Council meeting to adopt the records management system and records retention schedule. That concludes my presentation. Is there any questions?
Thank you, Clay. Any questions or comments from council?
Long overdue, for sure.
Yeah, let's move to do this.
Linda?
Yeah, we definitely need to update what we have. The purpose of this is so that we can go through this in depth on our own, and if there's any issues that we have, bring it back, or is it going to be brought back to us exactly the way it is right now?
So everything that was included in the back was intended for the council to have an opportunity to review, and then for today provide any input to the staff so that in a future meeting we would incorporate any of those changes so that we're not having to go back and forth and make those changes. So if there's anything that was included in that document that you would like to see changed or you didn't like or you may want to go in a different direction with, we wanted to have that conversation today so that we could provide something that was as comprehensive as possible at a future meeting and incorporate all the input from the council.
Okay, the area, and I'm trying to find it, I know it was in the old one, was in reference to emails. And the system of, if it's a public record, it has to be noted and printed and filed and all of this stuff. But as far as emails to us, everything is on the schedule of deletion that the city has. But if we deem it to be necessary for going forward on something else, if it relates to one of our regional committees or something like that, how then is that going to be worked in here, and then how do we save it into a personal file so that we can have it for reference as it retains or
So we just.
whatever I just said. Anyway, for regional committees, because there's a lot of times that we go back and forth, and it's like, oh, well, that was, sent in reference to something that happened 6 months ago, and you go back in your emails, and it's like, oops, it's gone. Have no idea what, now what it was unless we have a paper file ourselves, and that is in direct conflict to what we're trying to do in cleaning up records.
So we, about a year ago, the district started a program for that, to cover one of that particular purpose. And you create a folder. We have what's called a 3-year folder, and anything of that sort goes into that folder.
Oh, sorry. Anything of that sort that you need to save goes into that folder, and then it's not a part of the purged emails, but it's part of the system, but it's not part of the purged emails. So you identify it with project or program, in our case, that's what it is, and then, issue, and then you just drag it into that folder that is consistently on the side of your screen, and you can, or your email screen, and you retrieve them that way. Works really well for us.
So I think that's a really good point, and I know all of you are members of other regional groups, regional committees. I'm thinking League of California Cities, WRCOG. So we can definitely look into what we can do. I don't recall that anything specifically was included in the schedule. Can you, Clay?
Yeah, so the draft retention schedule has a 2-year retention policy on emails. That was feedback from staff and their departments on how, if the 60-day policy was working for their department or if we needed to move to a longer retention.
But do you
And-
think that if they had that opportunity to drag a specific thing over into a folder that stays there for a specific time rather than,
Operationally, we can definitely look at that. So we can follow up with, we can follow up with IT. I know that one of the big questions that we had in terms of the retention time, the 2-year period versus the 60 days, was whether that would be an added cost for IT or if that would create additional issues for IT. And we've been made aware that it wouldn't create any issues for us. So it's just a matter of
and one of the reasons
implementing.
that was done is so that we didn't have so much in storage on our computers.
One of the unique things on that was in our transition to the new system that we have now, where we're going through that rollout that's taking some time. That's really allowed us to operate a little bit differently. So that's really what's allowing us to see that as a viable opportunity for us.
It was brought to my attention that we do have a keep folder, right? So I started putting certain things I needed to keep into this keep folder, and it still falls off.
What's a what?
A keep. There's a keep that's broken down under, you have your sent, your archive, but it still drops off. Now, if the departments that showed me this, if they're able to keep it in their department because they use it, somehow some setting needs to be changed because this drives me crazy.
So we can follow up because, I got to admit, when I first started working for the city, I had this concept of how to do it, and all those emails and the folders that I'd created disappeared. And
Yes.
so I learned how to do it properly. So we can go ahead and go over that with everyone to make sure that it's done properly.
Yeah.
Teach us how to.
Because I'm sure there's people that I'm supposed to be getting back to that I never get back to because it just disappears.
They lose their information.
Yeah, it's gone.
Michael?
Well, I was just gonna say, there's easy ways to make new folders in Outlook and create rules that,
Yeah.
you can have emails from certain individuals or groups go into a different folder instead of your inbox.
So one of the things we had to do is go through all of our emails and decide which ones were important to keep, and separate from the normal list,
Right.
which was a real pain.
Yeah. Well, I have one like that, which is a legal file, that things from BWS go into this file and they're kept there. The only problem is I didn't set it up. Kathleen set it up when she was here, and that's the only one I have. So I'd like to have a few more.
I think the items that you're bringing up, I think, are the same things that collectively the entire organization needs to review as well because, as Clay stated, it's been decades since this was reviewed, and so it's really hitting on something that hasn't been done in a long time that we need to refresh everybody on.
Okay, good job. Very good job.
I have a question. Since we're moving away from hard copy files and going to electronic, what backup do we have? Because, all you have to do is read the newspaper or turn on the television news and you hear another story about some hacking that somebody's intruded into bank records or medical records. So I would just want some assurance that we've got redundancy, firewalls, for lack of, and I'm not a techie, but some protection against intrusion for one thing, and then some protection of retention capability should we have hard drive crashes or storage problems, that we've got some redundancy so that we can still retrieve it. Because once it becomes electronic and you don't have, file folders full of things that you can go manually search through, you're totally relying on all those little ones and zeros lining up so that you can get that document back.
So the records that would be up for destruction would be imaged in Laserfiche, which is the content management system that's certified, and it does have security features within the program. It does back it up. It also limits rights for who can use it. There would be set coordinators within each department that would have access to edit documents